During the Second World War and after the conflict had come to an end, there were many women who were executed, some for their resistance to the Germans during the conflict when their nations were occupied, or others who were executed later and were condemned for collaborating with the enemy. Some women were subjected to terrifying treatment at the end of the war, as inside of France they were forced to undergo the ugly carnival for allegedly sleeping with German soldiers. However, some women inside of Czechoslovakia and Hungary were ordered to be executed using a method known as pole hanging. This was a very public execution, and thousands of people saw a number of women being executed for different crimes and actions, but the executioners claimed that this method was actually quicker than using the gallows. But often the remains of these women were left on the pole to send a clear message to others, and it was a terrifying sight for many people to see, despite the fact they flocked to witness executions. Welcome to the Untold Past. Today we look at the women who were subjected to pole hanging during and after World War II, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. After the end of the war, inside of Hungary, there were many executions that took place outside the Academy of Music in Budapest. This building became synonymous with the executions of former politicians who had plunged the country into a tragic and terrible war that saw the land closely allied with the Nazis. Hungarians would fight alongside German soldiers, and they would be rocked by huge deportations of people from their lands to concentration camps. The truth was that there were many politicians who became Prime Minister quickly and came within power, and they collaborated with the Nazis and with Hitler and Mussolini. And after the war, a number of these politicians, including Bela Rady, were executed in Budapest, outside the Academy of Music. Thousands would flock to witness these executions and to see what they believed justice being carried out. However, what is the story of the woman who was executed inside of Budapest, in the same place it's believed as the former Prime Ministers? Maria or Manci Nagy was a World War II criminal who had been taken to a people's tribunal or trial. These were held to deal with those who were accused of crimes against humanity and of causing huge suffering inside concentration camps. Those members of the army who committed atrocities were also tried in this way, and following her trial, Maria or Manci was then condemned to death. But what did she do? It's believed that as she was a Second World War war criminal, she was known for torturing young Jewish women. This leads to the possibility that she was actually a woman who worked inside of the concentration camps. There were many women who became guards for the SS inside of camps within the Third Reich, such as Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen, and a number of them were condemned for their crimes. But usually women like Irma Grazer were executed in private within prison cells and execution chambers, well away from the eyes of the public. The name associated with the condemned woman, Manci, is short for Margaret in Hungary, and what is strange is that little documented evidence, except from pictures and photographs, remain regarding her fate and execution. She is considered an unknown war criminal, and from the images it's clear that she is a woman who was rather elderly. She looks rather respectable and is wrapped in a sweater, but looks petrified as she makes her way to her execution. But there is another possibility as to why she was executed. In the final days of the Second World War in Hungary, there was large-scale killing and looting as the Soviet Red Army invaded and took city after city before moving to Budapest. It's possible that Manci was one of those who stole the property of displaced people, or that she attacked women who were already suffering. For her to be sentenced to death, it's clear she must have done something that was very, very serious. She could also have been someone who was a collaborator with the Germans and who passed information on to the Nazis, the Gestapo or the SS, about possibly the locations of Jewish women or prisoners. There were people who were paid to hunt Jews across Europe, and they acted off tip-offs from neighbours and local people to do this. Perhaps Manci was one of those collaborators who were considered the lowest of the low inside of society. In Holland, there was one young woman who was executed for this crime, as she was deemed to have been a war criminal on the same level as the SS, who were deporting Jews to concentration camps. She was willingly giving over Jews to the enemy, and they would then be exterminated as soon as they arrived at sites such as Auschwitz. For Mansi Nagy to be executed in front of a crowd inside of Budapest, her offence and crime must have been incredibly serious and also shocking. The witnesses that day would have known that they were seeing the death of a war criminal. The events of her execution were in keeping with the executions of prominent Hungarians throughout the war. She was led out from her prison and was taken to an execution post and would be executed using the pole hanging method. With this, a noose was attached to a pole or a large wooden stake through a hook, which was then fed through an eyelet to the executioner, who was stood behind the condemned. When the wooden plank someone was standing on was removed, the executioner would pull on the noose and strangle the condemned against the pole. Death usually occurred in a few minutes. Maria or Mansi Nagy was accompanied by a priest who remained with her for her final moments, and the preparations for her execution were done by the executioner, who was wearing a suit and a hat, and also his assistant who helped him. These two, it's quite clear, were also the ones who performed the killing, and she would not be alone in her final moments. On the pole next to her was a white sheet in which a previously executed person was covered up in their final moments. This person would have been executed minutes before, and their body was then kept out of view of Mansi as she approached the stake. With her legs tied and her arms tied and the rope passed around her middle, she then climbed on top of the wooden box or step as the executioner fastened the noose and the rope around her neck. The step was then removed, and she was left, and within minutes she was executed by the executioner. The story of Mansi or Maria Nagy is one which is shocking. What did this elderly woman do that was so offensive and evil that she would be taken in front of a crowd in Budapest and would be executed in public? Judging by the shape of the windows and the brickwork behind her, the execution must have occurred outside the Academy of Music, where former ministers and politicians were also executed. These sometimes were executed by a firing squad, however. Former Prime Minister Ferenc Selassie, who was one who was considered one of the country's worst war criminals, would be executed on the same stakes and in the same manner as this elderly woman. It's believed that she did and would have collaborated with the Nazis and Germans, and may have given up Jewish women who were hiding out, and they were then taken to extermination centres and were killed. But the sight of the elderly lady making her way to her death is one which has still puzzled historians, as we do not know too much about her crime. But the ageing lady in her sweater, in the eyes of the Hungarian officials and the witnesses and the people of Budapest, must at the time have deserved her execution for whatever she did. Throughout World War II, Hitler ordered his army to rampage into different lands and territories, and these were then brought to heel in terrifying and brutal occupations, which resulted in much death and bloodshed. Czechoslovakia was occupied by the Germans, and Hitler in 1939 declared the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, and this left the nation powerless to German occupation and governance, and the country was known as the Arsenal of the Reich, as it was intended to produce a huge amount of armaments, weapons and equipment for the Wehrmacht and overall German war effort. Ruthless Nazi overseers such as Reinhard Heydrich were brought in to oversee these nations, and he brought with him a reign of terror which was intended to keep the country productive and to keep the Czech people at heel. Terrifying persecution laws were brought in, and it was common to see people hanging in the streets to send a clear message to people to stay in submission and to not resist. Herta Kasparova was born on the 21st of June 1923 in the town of Trieste, and her father had a humble job working on the railways. However, Herta from birth suffered a disability, and she walked with a limp caused by her right leg, and because of this, while she was at school she was bullied and treated terribly by other students. Her family spoke Czech and also German, and because of this, when Hitler seized control of the Sudetenland following the Munich Conference, she and her family were seen as favourable by Hitler. He wanted German families to live inside of these lands, and Hertha was given Reich citizenship because of her German origins and roots. She was of dual nationality and was also part of Hitler's Reich. She even changed her surname to Kasper to make it sound more German too. But in 1940, she started a new job inside of an office of the German criminal police in a town named Jihava, and she served as an interpreter. As she could speak Czech and German, she was seen as useful by the Gestapo, and with this she was involved in interrogations of many Czech people who were suspected of being involved in the resistance, and because of this she was now openly collaborating with the Nazi enemy. The Gestapo were known for roughly treating those who were suspected of being in defiance to the Nazi regime, and many people were tortured to death or were executed for their involvement. Hertha was now involved in the business of working for the Gestapo, and she was an important cog in securing the deaths of many Czech people. Many of those who worked with the Gestapo, the SS or the Nazis in any capacity were seen as the worst of the worst, and many were hunted at the end of the war to be executed for their collaboration with the enemy. She continued to translate for the Germans for a number of years, but at the end of the Second World War, as the Red Army were moving towards Hertha's hometown, she quickly left her job and went back to living with her parents in Trieste. But after the Prague Uprising, there were many different pockets of resistance in Trieste, and they targeted those who had helped the Germans throughout the occupation. Different Wehrmacht units then arrived to free a number of imprisoned German people, and Hertha Kasparova spoke to the German soldiers about the fact her house had been broken into. She even then identified a number of men and boys who had stolen items, and for this action she chose 11 people, and all of those 11 that Hertha had chosen were then dragged out to the courtyard of the town hall in her hometown, and they were then executed by a firing squad alongside a number of other rebels. Amongst the executed were allegedly some of the people who bullied Hertha Kasparova at school, and she got vengeance against them, utilising the German links that she had to have them shot. But the Germans also released her from her imprisonment at the hands of the rebels, and she then ran off to Austria and served in a number of jobs, including working as a cook. But part of her employment saw her working for the Red Army, her enemy. However, in February 1946 she was arrested and was then sent to Czechoslovakia to stand charges relating to being a collaborator with the Germans. She was placed on trial for the work she conducted alongside the Gestapo as an interpreter, and also as someone who was responsible for the executions of those who she had personally identified. At her trial, Hertha stated that, "I know that I caused the death of several people. I acted out of revenge." She was vengeful, and she knew she would be condemned. The court confirmed her darkest fears and sentenced her to death for collaborating with the Nazis and for treason against the Czechs. Her execution, however, was one which was to be very different, and she was only one of a very few number of women who were executed by pole hanging at the end of the Second World War. Pole hanging as an execution method was common in Czechoslovakia and Hungary at the end of the war, and a number of high-ranking politicians and government officials were executed in this manner instead of using a gallows. Hertha Kasparova was executed that evening after her death sentence had been given to her. She was walked outside to a meadow on the outskirts of Trieste, close to the castle. On the day before, the head of the Nazi offices inside of the town was executed in the very same way, and Hertha was brought out in front of the huge crowd. The pole-hanging post was 3 meters tall and it was 60 centimeters wide. When she was led up to the post, she lost her calm composure, and Hertha began to scream and shout for her life, and she even fell to the floor as her knees began to shake so much. She had to be carried to the execution post by the guards who were with her. Hertha wore a short dress to her execution, and she continued to cry and scream as she was led up to the execution post. The executioners, seeing her panic, began to work quickly, but they also made sure that everything would be performed correctly and professionally. With pole hanging, it relied on a number of steps, and they fastened a leather strap around her chest, which held her in place and in position in the air on the post briefly. The executioner then secured the rope around her legs and passed it through a pulley system, as well as making sure that Hertha Kasparova's arms were secured together to prevent a cleaner small drop. He then secured the noose around her neck and then checked his work before he signalled that he was ready. The hangman was stood on the step behind her post, and the sign was given to the assistant to release the drop, and he did so. The executioner guided Herta's neck with his hand and dislocated her neck, and with this she began to twitch and move side to side. But there was a problem, as her head began to move significantly, and it took a number of minutes for her to be confirmed dead. A number of Czech doctors came over to her remains, and they checked for a heartbeat, but there was nothing. With this, Herta was then cut down, and she was placed inside of a cheap coffin that lay under the pole, and within the coffin some person had even placed a number of flowers within the wooden box for her. Her remains were carried into the central cemetery in Jihlava, and she was interred alongside a number of German soldiers who had died in the local area fighting during the war. And it's interesting that she was buried in this place, as they saw her as the enemy, even in her death. The execution of Herta Kasparova was a huge event for the people in the town of Trieste, and people even brought tickets to secure the best position to see her death. It was almost like a medieval carnival, and for those inside of the Czech town, she was seen as the enemy, and someone who carried out the evils of the German army, and helped the Nazis with their persecuting work. In the translation work she completed for the Gestapo, she was complicit in the torture of many people, and her work helped the Gestapo to execute many accused of resistance. She was executed herself for the collaboration, but also for the fact she actively chose 11 men to be executed, and many of those were those people who mocked her at school. She had vengeance for this taunting in the most barbaric way, and Herta Kasparova contributed to a number of war crimes also. But her execution was a huge spectacle, and it was one of the final public executions carried out inside of Czechoslovakia. There were many countries that fell under German occupation and Axis influence during the Second World War, and collaborated with the Nazis. On the 25th of March 1941, Yugoslavia joined the Axis alliance, and this allowed the Germans to travel through their land to Greece. But the Axis powers later partitioned Yugoslavia, and inside of the different territories, there was a huge amount of terror which was carried out. Different groups such as the Ustasha militia instigated a reign of brutality upon people and civilians, and there were widespread executions and deportations to concentration and extermination camps. Lily Böhm was just 20 years old when she was executed, and very little is actually known about her life. She, during the Second World War, joined a Jewish youth organisation known as the Young Guard in her local town of Novi Sad. But during the conflict, her part of the country was invaded by the Hungarian military and army, who were in collusion with the Nazis. There were many people who did resist, and often resistance was met with the most brutal of reprisals, and people suspected of subverting occupying forces could be tortured, sometimes even to death. Lily Böhm got involved in the organisation of resistance activities against the Hungarians, and she also took part in groups who sabotaged Hungarian soldiers. This was a crime that carried the death sentence, and Lily Böhm knew how dangerous it was for her to resist. Being a woman too, she knew that she could be subjected to other horrors if she was also caught. But it was not long before she fell into the hands of her enemies. On the 20th of September 1941, Lily Böhm was caught by the Hungarian gendarmerie and the occupying police forces. Specifically on her person, she was carrying a weapon, and further investigations turned up that she was part of resistance cells, and that she was either harbouring and hiding weapons for resistors, or that she intended to use the weapon against Hungarian occupation forces. It's not known specifically what her intention was that day, but the crime of carrying a weapon was enough for her to be sentenced to death. It's assumed that she had a rough ordeal in prison locked up too, and the military court confirmed her execution. For a couple of months, Lily Böhm was left inside of a Hungarian-occupied prison in Újvidék, and she was held alongside other suspected resistors, but she was to be executed by pole hanging. On the 25th of November 1941, Lily Böhm was led out of her prison to her execution, and she was accompanied by a number of guards. Some of them walked her to the execution post, and she was greeted by the executioners who would take her life on the post. There was a large crowd gathered by the occupying forces to witness her execution, and the soldiers hoped that seeing this 20-year-old woman be executed in front of them would be enough to put the crowds off committing serious offences and, most importantly, prevent them from joining resistance groups and cells. With regards to Lily Berm's execution method of pole hanging, it was a variation of the short drop execution method, and it was used inside different lands and countries such as Hungary and Czechoslovakia. It used a pole or post for the gallows, and there were different steps for it to be carried out. It was referred to as a vergelegen, which translates as the strangling gallows, and it appeared to crowds a rather brutal execution method. There were a number of steps, and the condemned was brought to the post or pillar, which was usually 3 meters tall, and then ropes were attached to the condemned. A rope was attached around their feet, and it was then secured through a pulley system at the bottom and base of the post, and the condemned were held in the air by a chest sling, which passed over their body and under their arms. This held them still before the drop, and then the noose was secured around the neck of the victim, and the noose was secured to a hook at the top of the pole, and then the death sentence was usually read. Next, the chest sling was released, and the victim then jerked downwards, and the assistant executioner used a foot rope to guide the fall, and the executioner was usually more senior and experienced, and he would be stood on the platform behind the post. It was his job to place the heel of his hand under the jaw of the condemned, and this would increase the force on the neck and make this greater at the end of the drop, and the executioner, it was said, would manually dislocate the neck of the condemned by thrusting and forcing their head to one side. Pole hanging was considered by some to have been a much more humane and quicker execution method than even using the gallows, and it took roughly around a minute for someone to die when performed successfully. It was this fate that Lily Berm suffered. She was led up to the post and was held on it by a chest sling, and the executioner then secured the ropes around the pulley system and her body, and then the noose was secured around her neck. Her post, though, was not too tall, and it was certainly not 3 meters tall, and the executioner and his assistant then worked together to bring her life to an end. She was wearing a dark dress, and she had her arms secured to the post, and had no chance of escaping her fate on the execution post, as she was surrounded by many different Hungarian guards. These showed their collaboration to the Axis forces and alliance, as they were even wearing the classic German Stahlhelm, and to prevent people saving the young 20-year-old Lily Berm, 2 guards stood directly next to her body, and they guarded closely over it. Lily Berm was not the only woman who was subjected to a fate like this during the Second World War. There were many young women who were arrested and were seized for allegedly being involved in resistance against the Germans or the Axis forces. It was a very dangerous time, and Lily Berm, let's remember, was a Jewish woman who knew the persecution that was coming if she did not join the resistance, and she fought the occupation that she was forced to live under. She was executed for rather flimsy reasons, carrying a weapon in public, which during a time of conflict and war was not necessarily a huge shock. She may have had this on her person for personal protection, but as she was discovered to have been part of a resistance group, the Young Guard, this was enough for her to be sent to her execution. She likely had a rough interrogation ordeal before she was sentenced to death, and her body was left on the post for a while, so that a clear message could be sent to those in the local area. This was done to deter other people from joining the resistance, and was done to make people fall into line and not take up arms against the German enemy or the Axis enemy. One of the greatest fears of the Axis forces, who rolled into many different countries during World War II, was resistance, and to them, everyone was a suspect. Lily Berm was just a young 20-year-old woman when she was dragged to her execution on the post in front of a large crowd. There were teenagers who were executed by occupying forces during World War II, with some being hanged from trees for their suspected or confirmed resistance, and Lily Berm's story is one which is not the most well known, and she deserves to be remembered for her actions in standing up to her enemies inside of her homelands. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.